Well, Brett, I really appreciate you being here with me on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. For folks who are unfamiliar with you and the work that you do, would you mind briefly introducing yourself?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for having me. My name is Brett Jenks. I'm the president and CEO of RARE, and RARE is a global conservation organization.
And so, I mean, one of the first things for me that stuck out was the tenure that you've had with Rare, being in that CEO position for now 20 years or so. And so I'd love to start first, I suppose, with how have you considered remaining fresh in the same exact role for such a significant amount of time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I ask myself regularly, how long have I been here? How have I been here too long? How much longer should I be here? But what keeps the job fresh is the ability to work on new problems, to work with new people, to develop new solutions. And so we have run radio soap operas in developing island nations. We have built ecotourism and community development programs with indigenous communities in Central America. We have scaled a grassroots way of building civic pride in nature and brought it to literally 60 countries. We're now working on climate change. We're working on coastal fishery recovery, agriculture. So what keeps it fresh is that there's certainly no dearth of environmental challenges. Those aren't going away anytime soon. And I think with that tenure, hopefully comes a little bit of wisdom to be able to spot what the right kind of problem and what the right kind of solution set is. That's what keeps it interesting. Of course, half the time I have to catch up with my own team or my board members or our donors, because it's a very vibrant community. There's a lot of people now working to make changes in the world. And it's an exciting time to be in the environmental space. Daunting, but exciting.
Well, I at least like that phrasing. Momentarily, it definitely makes me feel a little bit more hopeful and optimistic. I imagine you're in the space of behavior change. But I wonder along those lines of some of this wisdom that maybe has been gained, and as well, you mentioned that phrase there of catching up. Well, what do you feel like has changed in your role personally as a leader of the organization, spanning these 2 decades with all this expansive growth?
I think in the beginning, it was really just figuring out what does it mean to run a nonprofit? Who are all these stakeholders, and what do you do with all these different goals and all these different, perspectives? It's very different from the private sector, where there's a bottom line, there's a product to sell, there's a target audience. Here you've got trustees and board members, you've got stakeholders and beneficiaries, you've got staff. There are thought leaders in the space, and there are particular things to prioritize. So in the beginning, it was a lot of just basic learning about what is a nonprofit and how does it operate. I think then it became about impact pretty quickly. And it was, once you can make sure you can pay the bills day to day, how do you have the greatest impact, the greatest return on investment? And that quest has not ended. I mean, that's the ever-present question of how much impact can we have given our size and our scope, and what are the core competencies that we need to develop. I think you then go from just keeping the lights on to figuring out how to have impact, to then really learning how to be strategic. What does it mean to pick the kinds of problems you want to work on, the kinds of competencies you want to develop in order to be able to solve those problems? How do you balance inclusivity with decisiveness? How do you balance innovation with discipline? How do you balance innovation with impact? And how do you make sure that every year the organization gets better across a multiplicity of targets? And so over time, you then get to the point of, I would say, the stage where you have a kind of balanced scorecard. or a dashboard that has 6 to 12 sort of meters on it. And you're looking after culture, you're looking after brand, you're looking after risk, you're always following impact. You're looking at the short term versus the long term. You're thinking about talent and competencies. And so that maybe that's the sort of the graduate level CEO-dom. I don't know. Hopefully hopefully what I'm saying implies some sort of progression. I hope I've gotten better at this over the years. Some days it certainly doesn't feel like that. It is always a challenge. This is it's a challenging time to be a leader. It's a challenging time to be an environmentalist, but it's also a really urgent time. It's never felt more relevant. It's never felt like there were more people talking about it and thinking about it. And it's sad to think that it has taken forest fires, flooding, the specter of sea level rise, mass migration, science fiction type calamities for us to really get everybody's attention. But this moment has arrived.
And so that has me curious, because all the folks who work within Rare, you yourself, y'all are human beings, and there's all these this laundry list of crises, environmental crises that seem to be taking place across the globe. I imagine that just like everyone else in the world who can react to that with a sense of fear and maybe as well overwhelm and angst and a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, I'm wondering, how have you been able to look at this moment as the leader of the organization for Rare and shift that in some way to be something that allows your team, your organization to rise to this extraordinary challenge and opportunity that we have before us?
Seems like a more pressing question now than it's ever been before, certainly in my career, where 20, 25 years ago, the conservationist challenge was to try to get people's attention, and just getting a grant and the chance to go out and try something new was a really big victory. I think over the course of the last 20 years, it's become much more about, wow, we have a responsibility. We have engaged millions of additional people in this charge, but there's now a lot of life that depends on us succeeding. And so when you look at the scope of the problem and you see, well, if you look at the planet, we have a tragedy of the commons in our atmosphere. We all depend on it. We all utilize it, but nobody owns it. Nobody manages it. And it's our atmosphere. It's the one thing that has enabled civilization, right? A steady temperature and this oxygen that we count on daily, and this heat shield from the rest of the galaxy, right? There's also a tragedy of commons under our feet, in the soil that we have taken for granted, and in the fresh water supply that we count on every day to grow our food. And then finally, there's this huge tragedy of commons in 70% of the planet's surface in the ocean. So whether you're talking about the ocean or soil, or the land, or the atmosphere, we have a shared endowment that we've all inherited, and there's really nobody in charge. And so if you think of the problem that way, it becomes absolutely overwhelming to consider, how do you get 7.5 going on 10 billion people to individually and collectively take responsibility for our shared, endowed nature, this biosphere, this planet. So when you then look at wildfires in California, and you look at typhoons in the Philippines, and you look at a cyclone in Mozambique, and you see mudslides, and you see flooding in Europe, you see heat waves that are killing our elderly, and you recognize that these are the direct results. These are the tragedies of us not managing our commons. And so then to your question, so what do you do on a daily basis, to keep the faith and to keep people moving in a positive direction? And I will just say, with COVID, with the murder of George Floyd, and the racial awakening in the United States, which is very different from the rest of the world, although it is impacted and rippled through the rest of the world, when you take COVID, a racial awakening, a climate reckoning, the loss of biodiversity, the data on the species extinction crisis, it is a very challenging time to believe that you can make change in the world. And so the antidote, I believe, is what Dan Heath long ago called the bright spots. Focus on what's working and do more of it. And so we spent a lot of time trying to, within RARE, identify what's working and find ways to celebrate what's working, to call out our colleagues and our partners and our and colleagues, anyone in the space that we see succeeding, and figure out how can we emulate them, how can we shine a spotlight on them, how can we leverage what they're doing, because in each one of these categories there are bright spots. There's a lot of great things happening out there, and if positive news sold as well as scary news sold, we'd all know a lot more about what is working. So if you look at climate change, you look at the growing use of renewable energy around the world, the growing commitment of national leaders to addressing climate change, the growing body politic that cares. If you look at the oceans and you look at the myriad examples of marine protected areas being set up to protect the ocean, especially by local people living along coastlines. If you look at the work of, for example, a RARE program like Fish Forever, you can see 1,100 communities and counting in 8 countries restoring their coastlines, restoring coastal fisheries. With our work in Make It Personal, you can see a greater interest in Americans wanting to know what they can do about climate change and beginning to take individual action. And so the key is to not get overwhelmed by the headlines, but to have this sort of practice that says every day, let's be grateful for the progress we're making and let's do more.
That connects me to the really great work of the folks at Solutions Journalism, who, when in doing my research before this interview, I saw one of the founders, David Bornstein, made a comment on RARE too, to congratulate y'all on the work that you do in the organization. And so exactly what you're mentioning there, there's a lot of good small news organizations right now that are promoting more so exactly what you're talking about, these bright spots. And I've found some solace in starting to follow and track those folks a bit more. But I'd love to hear a bit deeper, Brett, and maybe we can start to bridge this into what is RARE's unique theory of change and approach to influencing and enacting change. Can you share some more of the bright spots that y'all are seeing?
Sure. So we specialize in essentially translating behavioral insights from academia. The kinds of papers where a Stanford researcher will have a group of children or a group of students with a piece of chocolate cake in the middle of the table, and one group will be told, think about how ashamed you're going to be if you eat this cake when we leave the room. And another group will be told, think about how proud you're going to feel when we leave the room and you don't eat the cake. And then another group is told nothing, that just they're left in a room with a piece of chocolate cake. And what the researchers found was that unbeknownst to many environmentalists who want to make people feel ashamed for doing the wrong thing, enabling a sense of pride is literally twice as effective as a motivator. So that's one, you would call that an academic insight. Pride beats shame every day of the week. And then you would ask yourself, well, how is that relevant for the environmental movement? And fortunately, we had a bright spot built in. There was a guy named Paul Butler, and his story is iconic within RARE's history. At age 22, he was invited based on a paper he wrote as an undergrad, he was invited by the Minister of Forestry of St. Lucia to come down to the West Indies. And for a couple $100 a month, basically a stipend, help save the St. Lucian parrot. And what he did was simply identify how proud St. Lucians were of their newfound independence from France and Great Britain for 150 years, had been fighting over them and had traded hands 14 times. Finally, in the 1980s, St. Lucia is independent. And so Paul said, why don't we link pride to the habitat and this species? And it was so successful as a concept, they ended up electing the St. Lucian parrot as their national symbol. You know, it's on their passport. And so that's an example of how he knew before the Stanford research the power of pride. So sometimes the research gets validated on campus. Sometimes you take the research and you can apply it in the real life, in the real world. And so what we've wanted to do at RARE is build something we call the Center for Behavior in the Environment. We have an advisory committee that's sort of a who's who in the behavioral science arena. You have, Adam Grant, best-selling author. You have Cass Sunstein, who wrote Nudge with Richard Thaler. You have Elke Weber, who has her own lab at Princeton. A group of academics and writers. Then you've also got some change makers and a diverse group of people from around the world. They advise us. Then we've got partnerships with researchers at Stanford, at Yale, at MIT, at Harvard, at Penn, et cetera, all over the country, Indiana. And so together, we're able to then pick the kinds of problems we want to work on in the real world, go out and identify all of the behavioral insights that are relevant, and then begin to develop newly minted hypotheses where, for the first time, that body of behavioral insight is being brought to something like, how do you get people, Americans, to buy electric vehicles? Maybe more important, and I'll say more about this in a second, how do you get Americans to buy electric vehicles and then tell all their friends? How do you get Americans to buy electric vehicles, tell all their friends, and then explore what the rebates are, what the policies are that incentivize EVs so that those can be improved and this cycle can continue from individual change to collective action so that engagement leads to a solution. And so, some of the insights that have become so fascinating, and this really is under the heading of bright spots in the behavioral science that should give you hope. So there's a guy named, he's a postdoc. He's now at Stanford. Now, he was at Stanford. He was a postdoc there. Now he's at Princeton. He works with Elke Weber, who's a RARE board member, full disclosure. This guy's name is Greg Sparkman. And Greg, when he was a postdoc at Stanford, did this really fascinating study where he stood outside with some of his co-researchers, stood outside a cafe on Stanford's campus in Palo Alto and handed out $5 vouchers in exchange, for lunch at a cafe in exchange for a quick conversation. And the voucher gave a discount, so an incentive to the purchaser, but also let him then go back and track what they eventually bought at the store. And this is a sort of a typical on-campus experiment. There was a control group who was told nothing. Then there was there were two experimental groups, and one of them was told that Americans are eating less meat, and they were 17% more likely to buy a vegetarian meal. There was another group that was told Americans are starting to eat less meat, which is a very subtle distinction, but it implies that this is a new trend. Those folks were 34% more likely to essentially avoid meat in their lunch decision. Now, it might be a fleeting effect. This might not last till dinner. But at that moment, what Greg identified was the difference between, a norm that would describe what people are currently doing and a norm that describes what he calls a dynamic norm, meaning, hey, the norm is changing. And that grabs people's attention. And then there's a bunch of other follow-up research that shows that arguably what a dynamic norm does is it signals, one, there's a new norm coming. Two, people are changing. Three, it must be easier than I think to change. Four, there must be an expectation that I'm going to do this too. And that led us to do a whole body of research and this is the last thing I'll say about the academic side of this work. That led to another body of research by Eric Tulane at the Center for Behavior at Rare, who found that when presented with things like EVs or solar panels on the rooftop or buying carbon offsets or adopting a plant-rich diet, political viewpoints didn't move the meter. Democrats and Republicans were equally interested, which was shocking to us. It also concluded that your belief in climate change actually didn't move the meter very much. If you took out the climate change framing, Democrats and Republicans were equally, and climate believers and climate deniers were equally interested in these individual behaviors. What started to move the meter was whether you thought other people expected you to adopt these behaviors. What moved it even further, in fact, the most, was observing anyone else adopting these behaviors. So if you see solar panels on a friend's rooftop, you're way more likely than the average citizen to eventually get solar panels. Same with EVs, same with a plant-rich diet. Behaviors are social and contagious. That's the human condition. And so the question becomes, how do you leverage those behavioral insights? I didn't mean to go on about that so long, but I wanted to give you a sense of this growing body of really critical research and how it applies, how it gives us hope that we can make change. I'd be happy to also tell you about what that means for a few different environmental problems, if you'd like.
Well, I'd love that, and I do appreciate you going into those examples. I think they're very helpful to crystallize exactly what we're talking about here. And maybe in the context of EVs, of electric vehicles, what perhaps do you think we're missing then in that formula that's keeping us from a wider spread adoption and starting something of that flywheel that you mentioned there that would allow us to make a much greater accelerated change?
Well, certainly we know we need legislation and we need financial incentives, but that's sort of been the go-to for quite a long time. And what our research showed that 50% of Americans don't even know that there are any financial incentives for electric vehicles, which I found just shocking, but true. So it's fair to say we believe at Rare that while that legislation is critical, just having that legislation is not enough. In fact, even if the Biden the $3.5 trillion budget comes through on top of the $1 trillion infrastructure budget comes through, even if you had comprehensive climate legislation and lots of incentives, you would still, much like drunk driving, much like family planning, much like cigarettes smoking cessation, you would still need major investments in behavior change, not just economic incentives, because they're not necessarily the same thing. So with EVs, what we found is, one, people have no idea how many of their friends are currently thinking about electric vehicles. People don't know how many of their friends are shopping for them. People don't know how many of their friends actually believe that they should be driving electric vehicles, especially if they can get green energy at home or at work to charge them. And so people don't know that other people are now expecting them to transition to electric vehicles. And so that gap, the gap in understanding between what we think is expected of us and what's actually expected of us is something to be leveraged. Another challenge is we know that the more infrastructure there is, the more EVs you see, and the more charging stations you see, the greater there is interest in electric vehicles. And that's sort of just the contagion of making it present. If it's available, if you can recall it, if it seems simple, if you see other people doing it, it just seems much less insurmountable than it did. So I think after you get to legislation, after you get to the incentives, which will only get us so far, it's really about the social norm. The next generation, kids today do expect their parents to convert to electric increasingly in their next purchase.
Yeah.
Older people are starting to see the potential economic benefits. Well, there's also there's a number of myths out there that are being broken down, but they're so ingrained that they need to be, we need to chip away at them. One of them is that EVs are far more expensive. Well, the upfront cost may be, but the lifetime experience, the lifetime value is actually higher for multiple brands at multiple pricing points. It is a great investment to buy an inexpensive electric vehicle because of what you're going to save over the course of the lifetime in maintenance and in petrol and gasoline. And yet people, generally speaking, have no idea that's the case. They think they think every electric vehicle is a $100,000 Tesla, and that's just not the case anymore.
Mm. So to me, it seems that it's so deeply rooted in awareness and in education being a major tipping point. But I guess as well, there's the things to like the step before to get more of those charging stations placed. And it kind of makes me wonder, Brett, especially in that example, I guess, with electric vehicles, it can feel as though there are a lot of special interests who may not like the idea of us, electrifying our fleet of vehicles. And I'm interested if that's ever come into conflict in your work with Rare, whatever communities you've worked in globally. Have there ever been kind of competitions in messaging and communication that have created some barriers to influencing the change that y'all hope would occur?
I think that's there. There have been times when, for example, generally speaking, I would say in our history, no, because we've tended to work in remote, rural areas in the global South. Mm. And when you're in remote, rural, coastal Mozambique, Philippines, Indonesia, Brazil, Central America, you're not usually competing with very political messaging that's being spearheaded by interest groups with big marketing budgets.
Gotcha.
So and we tend to have a very pro-community, pro-resource user and very positive messaging that's about pride and an esprit de corps and a spirit of, civic engagement and civic pride. So the answer is no. I think where we are starting to feel it for the first time is for 30 years, there's been a consistent drumbeat by many of the leading climate activists and NGOs in the United States that calling for comprehensive climate legislation, investing in technology, green technology, fuel standards and emission standards, the mix and allocation of energy within each individual state. And that's really, when I say there's been a call for comprehensive climate legislation, it's local, state, and federal level. And so when we start talking about the value of having, for example, with our Make It Personal program, we are making the case that there's another avenue that doesn't compete with the call for comprehensive climate legislation, but that complements it. Mm. That there is a way of engaging the potentially 90% of Americans who may not see themselves as activists. They may not be signing up to be on your list, and they may not be the kinds of people who regularly write to their local representative, but they are going to buy a car, and they do have home energy, and they put meals on the table, hopefully 3 times a day, and they eat at local restaurants, and they are consumers, and so their behavior represents a tipping point for the market. It represents a tipping point for collective action on the individual behaviors. And so we have done an analysis that says if 10% of Americans adopted a plant-rich diet, bought carbon offsets, contracted green energy, either signing up for a green utility or putting solar panels, if you own your house, putting solar panels on the roof, reducing food waste, electrifying your vehicle, making your next car, an EV or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and flying less, even one less trip a year. If 10% of Americans did that, that's the equivalent of 460 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year, which, forget the numbers because no one really understands what that even means. That gets us well on our way to hitting our target under the Paris Agreement. Now, there's some folks who may not agree. We have the data to show it. But regardless, even if we know individual behavior won't solve the climate problem, but imagine if we could not only reduce U.S. greenhouse gases, if you assume 10% of Americans represent 50% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So the most privileged 10% are producing half of the country's greenhouse gas emissions because of the size of their home or homes, their air travel, their transportation, the multiple cars, et cetera. Their footprint is far higher than the average American. So if we could get those 10% to do the right thing, that's going to set trends in the marketplace. It's also going to give cover to the elected officials because they're going to see all those EVs. They're going to see those solar panels, and they're going to see an engaged, active citizenry who are going to be way more likely to speak up about their experience, about the rebates, about the legislation, about what makes it simple, what makes it difficult. So there's a really, we believe, totally untapped opportunity to leverage individual behavior. And people really, you know, there's one bit of backlash from folks who would say, look, that's what British Petroleum tried to do 20 years ago when they wanted us to think about our carbon footprints. So sort of like recycling, the consumer can feel guilty, so the corporation doesn't have to change. Now, I get that, and I'm empathetic to that viewpoint. And yet I still believe 30 years later, we have a lot of activation to do. There's a lot of room for engagement. And I think we need to avoid another behavioral insight, which is the single action bias. There is no one action that is going to solve climate change. And if we don't get most of America involved somehow, even if it's just the simple decision of how to cool your home or what kind of car to drive, if we don't provide those on-ramps, I'm not sure we're going to get there.
Yeah, I'd undoubtedly agree with you that the concept of individual action, it's a tough thing, especially when you do feel like you are, you know, looking upon this mountain or this behemoth that needs to be changed, fixed, or corrected in some way. But it's certainly something that leads to what, you know, creates culture. You know, those individual actions are very important, exactly as you're speaking to here, into influencing one way or another, the friends and the family around you, the colleagues at work. So those actions are, you know, extremely important. And that's very core to what we do here at Grow Ensemble. Is Ensemble means together. You know, we want to normalize the concept of thinking about, you know, how our actions every single day influence the community around us, you know, as we grow collectively. And
well, Cory, let me give you one other example, because
please.
I think outside of the conservation space, one of my favorite examples is the designated driver. You know, in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, a lot of young people, a lot of old people, a lot of people died from drunk driving, and they still do today, but far fewer numbers. Why is that? There was legislation at the time. There was a movement to create a seatbelt culture. And yet there were still people dying regularly every weekend from teen drunk driving, from adult drunk driving. What changed? The legislation was in place. The fines were in place. So the economics and the policy were well established. But there was sort of no behavioral approach until a group of researchers decided to come up with and test this concept of the designated driver. They created a new behavior to substitute, a good behavior to substitute for the bad behavior. And then they figured out how to popularize it, how to make it a norm. And then they got Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, this group of moms across the country, to adopt this practice and this vernacular. And what was an academic exercise with a few pilots became a national and global movement. I think it actually started in Canada. Then some U.S. researchers, and it was, I think actually it was a I forget, but it was literally a Canadian club, I believe, started the research. A group of academics in Boston picked it up, and eventually we have now, well, fortunately now there's ride sharing and Uber, but they are the designated drunk drivers. And most young people today make sure they have someone as a designated driver. That's a great example where a new norm is established, where one individual's behavior really matters. Similarly, what I think we're probably most proud of at Rare is just in the last 9 years, we've built a program around the tragedy of the commons on the sea, where for 3 generations, millions of coastal fishers have been systematically and unknowingly overfishing their local waters. So where grandpa went out and filled a boat in 4 hours, mom went out and filled a bucket in 4 hours. And today, mom or dad is going out and they're barely able to put food on the table. We are restoring those coastal fisheries, where there's really not many rules, not many regulations. There's not much of a Coast Guard throughout the coast, the territorial seas of the developing world. And you would say this is an impossible task because everyone is racing to catch the last fish. So who's going to step forward and say, well, I'm going to sacrifice and not fish in an area for a little while so that the fish can recover? What if I told you there's now hundreds of thousands of fishers in 8 countries feeding millions of people their daily supply of fish and setting up regimes that are going to make sustainable 1 million square miles of coastline? That's what's possible when you embrace individual behavior to push collective action. So from designated driving and reducing drunk driving to restoring the ocean, these things can work in some really significant ways.
And then so for the person listening in who has an interest in what you mentioned before of activating this 10% of the American population, where do you think is the starting point, or some of that?
Well, I think if you're the CEO of a company, I'd say you have probably responsibility number one is establish your net zero commitment and look around at your peers and see who is going net zero, because it's going to be the leaders in your space. That ship is sailing right now, so you want to jump on it. The second step then, I think, is to engage your employees in helping them on the same journey. So just as you're thinking about your infrastructure, your travel, your servers, your energy within your offices, your heating, your cooling, your HVAC, your supply chains, your shipping. Think about the lifestyles of helping your employees live your corporate values. And so we're designing right now a pilot where we call it green benefits, where we're engaging corporations in a testing phase to engage their employees in moving to net zero by looking at how they commute, by looking at what they eat, by looking at how often they fly for work or personally. So it's those same behaviors, but packaged in a kind of green benefits way. So that's the message to corporate leaders. If you're an individual citizen, we are starting a pilot design in Boston, and we're going to be looking for people who are interested in these behaviors and what would like to be the first followers, so to speak, or really the leaders, to share your story about your EV, share your story about your solar panels, share your story about your transition to a more plant-rich diet, or how you got your reluctant husband to reduce the hamburger intake each week, just to be stereotypical about things. Visiting rare.org and /make it personal, or just visiting rare.org, you'll find it. There are resources and there are ways for you to get involved. We are still in the very early pilot stage. We're doing a lot of research, polling and testing. We're also working with a network of micro-influencers to figure out what are the messages that are going to resonate with people. But corporate leaders, individual citizens, universities, if you have a following of, let's say, 5,000 or more people, and you would like to test out your micro-influencing for climate change chops, let us know.
Excellent. And Brett, holistically, I mean, I know this is what we've spoken at length about thus far, but I'm very curious for you personally, Well, what do you feel like you've learned about humanity in your 20 years as the CEO of Rare? Maybe some things that you just couldn't possibly have grasped before.
I, I, I hope I can make, humbly, I hope I can respond in a way that is somehow meaningful. What have I learned in my little slice of life about humanity in the last 20 years? I think the most important thing that I've learned is the idea that just within my lifetime, I'm 54 years old, we have put into the atmosphere most of the greenhouse gases that are causing all of these problems. That just in a couple generations, we have put ourselves on a path for serious human destruction. You know, forget the planet. The planet will survive. The planet will be fine. The Earth will recover. And I mean, we should still do our best to avoid the extinction crisis and protect the habitat. And really, that's the mission, you know, of our organization. But just in terms of self-preservation, I think it's really important to note that humanity might be the only self-aware animal in the entire universe. That may be a bit of a stretch, but we don't really know. That is a direct result of having 10,000 uninterrupted years with a steady climate. That steady climate has enabled this proliferation of biodiversity around the world and civilization. It has let us plant crops on 5 continents. It has let us set up schools and government and governance and politics and art and culture. It has let us develop language, everything that is humanity, anything that makes you cry or sing or shout with joy has come from something that's been invented due to this period of climate stability. And yet, unbeknownst to each one of us individually, our daily lives and the governments that we elect and the corporations that sell us all our stuff have unwittingly conspired to put all of that at risk. So what I've learned is that life is really precious, and this human experience is even more precious. We are self-aware. I have a buddy named David Grinspoon who wrote a book called Earth in Human Hands. And the ultimate image of this book is we are like a young girl, you know, age 3, staring at her hands. And she has no idea the power of her humanity to bioengineer, to create artificial intelligence, to literally shape the world. So we've gone from, just in my lifetime, this 10,000-year-old Holocene to the Anthropocene, the age of man, the age of mankind, because geologically we are now a force reshaping ocean currents, reshaping glaciers, reshaping mountains. We are as gods shaping our own planet, the planet on which we were created. None of us are prepared for that level of influence and power. So we have so much homework to do to figure out how to catch up to our own humanity and how to wield these new tools we're developing responsibly. So that's the long answer. The short answer is, I think humanity does 2 things really well. We do self-interest incredibly well, and we do competition really well. And because of those 2 things, we cooperate when it is in our self-interest, and at times we cooperate really effectively. So as I think about if I had another lifetime to live, you know, if I had a 150-year time horizon instead of hopefully another 25 or 30 good years, I would love to partner with a group of people to think about what does it take for society to cooperate? What does it take for us to grow our consciousness, to grow our skill set for cooperation, for empathy, for managing the commons? You know, what will it, if a group of very poor, let's just say undereducated fishers with second or third grade educations in a coastal community in the global South can learn against all odds how to teach each other how to fish cooperatively and sustainably. How is it possible that we cannot learn in some of the most developed nations on earth how to cooperatively reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? So maybe that's, in short, what I've learned and what I hope for, but that's my answer.
Thank you for that answer at length. I think it provides a lot to think about. I go back and forth often, and I'm very curious in this as to ask people of, what do they think is at the core of human behavior? Like what are the core of our motivations or other things, or like, do we at our core want to do things that are good for others in our environment, and perhaps there's just some friction that's keeping us from doing so. And it seems as if you and your organization at Rare, y'all have some very particular, specific firsthand experience with that space. So, Brett, I want to be respectful of your time here, but before we finish up, can I ask you a couple rapid fire questions?
Sure.
So first one, what might be a book, film, or other resource that you might recommend to someone? Maybe something that's impacted you recently, or something you always come back to?
I'll list three real quick off the top of my head. Just this weekend, I watched Breaking Boundaries on Netflix.
Okay.
And it's a chance for Johan Rockström to share his theory of planetary boundaries. And it's a little depressing, but it ends with a list quite similar to some of the things we've mentioned that really get at the potential for each of us to do something to make a difference, but to recognize our limits. The second book was something I read last year, and I've been recommending it to everybody. I heard about it on Ezra Klein's podcast, and it's The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I'm not a big sci-fi guy. This is science fiction, but it is, for me, the best account of climate change currently that I've read. And it's, as usual, it's a fictional account that really sings the truth. But it's sort of the question of which is the ministry, which is the UN agency that represents future generations? And if they were really doing their job, what would they be doing? If you ask yourself that question, Kim Stanley Robinson answers that question in this book. On the behavior change front, I have a couple of favorites. I think Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein is a classic. It's celebrated its 10th year anniversary last year, but Dan Heath and his brother Chip Heath are two of my favorites, and they wrote a book called Switch. There's even a chapter about Rare and Rare Pride campaigns in it. And Switch, to me, is just a great introduction to how to make change in the world. So I guess off the top of my head, those are a couple books, a couple documentaries.
Excellent.
Hope that helps.
No, that's great. A next question for you: what's maybe one organization, individual, or business who's doing really exceptional work in the space of climate and the environment that you think deserves a plug?
So a new friend of mine, his name is John Marshall. He's got a group called Potential Energy, and he's really bringing his 25 years of experience in marketing and advertising and strategy to sort of beef up political campaigning around climate change. So a lot of focus groups, a lot of data and clear insights on what's the right messaging for climate. And I think we need to reinvigorate climate communications. I think he's one of the guys that's really helping bring that about.
And one final question for you, Brett, what's one last piece of advice that you might leave with our listeners, folks who are social entrepreneurs, sustainable business leaders, change makers from all sectors all over the world?
I think the key to making change is empathy. So make sure you take the time to understand with whom you're communicating, to understand, take the time to listen, to know what you're up against, and then design your program or design your intervention with those folks clearly in mind. Because if you can boost the salience of the issue, if you can build motivation and you can help them overcome barriers, all of which requires that you really know them, you can make change.
Excellent advice for us to end on. Brett, thank you so much for taking the time. Finally, where should folks keep up with you and Rare? Where are the best places you'd like to direct us?
Probably our website, rare.org. That's the rare.org. That's a good place to start.
Perfect. We'll have all things Rare linked up at the show post at growensemble.com. Thanks a lot, Brett.
Great. Thank you, Cory. Appreciate it.